Hey guys, welcome to episode 5 of the L24 engine rebuild series. In this episode, we will be disassembling the lower half of the engine, namely pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft, and main bearing caps. So I want to make an effort to be really clear here about the numbering system that I'm going to be using. On an inline 6-cylinder engine like the L24, the cylinders are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from front to back. And when we say front, we mean timing cover, your fan, and just the literal front of the car, and the rear is the flywheel. And the reason why I'm making this effort to be clear about something that seems really simple, because it is because sometimes when people do this, it seems like they are referring to the firing order and the piston number as opposed to the cylinder number when they're doing this process of labeling and removing pistons and connecting rods. And you can see here for an inline 6-cylinder L24 engine, the firing order is 153624. So if you kind of do this process like I did, let's say, okay, what order are they fired in? You just come up with the same numbering here. So piston 1 is actually in cylinder 1. Piston 5 is actually in cylinder 2, 3, 6, 2, 4. Now, that's kind of confusing because people aren't always clear about what it is they're saying when they put that number down. But for the purpose of this, I'm only going to be using the cylinder number, the simple 1 to 6 in order, and you can kind of rely on that. And actually, this is what I'm going to be giving to the machine shop, and I want to be clear with them that when I say the number here, it's the cylinder number. So with that out of the way, I just kind of went through and made some labels here that I could put inside of a box that makes it really simple to, we're going to be labeling these pistons as well with these markers, but I wanted to have some redundancy in the labeling because it's really important that you don't mix up cylinders, you don't mix up connecting rods, that the connecting rod caps don't go on the opposite way that they came off. You just have to be really meticulous about all of these things, and any little bit of preparation, I would say, is worth it. And like I said here, some multiple redundancies to make sure you've labeled properly and you're not mixing up are very well worth it. So then I flipped the engine back to right side up, which of course came with a little bit of oil that had to be drained as well. And then I began the process of cleaning the piston heads so that we could later mark them with a marker of some kind. And I just used a regular bristle brush. That's really all that was needed, and I don't think you would want to use anything more abrasive than that. And some carb cleaner really did most of the work there. So to do this, and really the rest of everything that's going to be shown in this video, you need to have something to turn the engine. And the easiest thing, and what I ended up using, was I just put back in that 26 millimeter bolt that attaches to the crankshaft on the front of the engine, that the crankshaft pulley attaches to. So that's the easiest thing. You can just snug that back in, and then you can take a ratchet and turn it. And after I had everything kind of beautifully cleaned, I looked at the pistons firing, quote unquote, in order here. With the pistons all cleaned, you want to take a marker of some kind. I used a Sharpie, and we want to mark 2 pieces of critical information on the top of the piston. Number 1, which piston it is, so which piston from 1 to 6. Again, front is 1, and 6 is the back, the flywheel. And you also want to mark the direction of where the front of the engine is from the perspective of that piston. So you can go here one by one and just rotate the engine with that crank bolt that we put back in here and mark them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and make sure you get the arrow that points to the front on each piston as well. Next, you want to rotate the engine back over and mark the connecting rod caps in the same order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You also want the arrow as well, and I know there's not a lot of space to write on there. It might be easier if you just want to do a collection of dots, 6 dots for the 6-cylinder and so on. I found it easy enough just to write it on the space there, but you just have to write pretty small. So then we can actually start removing the connecting rod caps as well and pushing the pistons out. And it's a pretty simple process. It's just something you have to take your time with. There are 2 bolts on the side of the connecting rod cap that need to be removed that you're going to need a breaker bar for most likely. Once you have them broken, it takes almost no effort to remove them by hand, so that's nice. And the one thing you want to make sure that you do here is organize when you take things off, because the reason we're marking everything is that to make sure everything goes back on the same way. And when you take the piston out, you want to make sure that you have everything ready to put the cap back on the same exact way. The same bolt goes in the same hole, and so on. So to go a little bit more in depth, once you have the nut off, and again, you put it in somewhere where you, they're organized and it's going to go back on the same way, the bolts may just fall down, and that's fine. I would recommend having a magnet of some kind, particularly a long reach magnet, ready to go, because you're going to drop one of these and it's kind of a pain to try to put your finger down and get it. A lot of the bolts will just stay there once you remove the nuts, and then you can just kind of push it out. You can see I dropped something here. But yeah, once you have the nut off, you can just kind of push the bolt through and catch it. And it's really helpful to have a magnet if you don't. But once you have everything off, you can just take the cap off and you can just slowly push the piston out. So you can see for some reason on this first piston here, I left the one bolt in there, and left it for after I removed the cap. I guess it was maybe kind of stubborn, but once you have everything out, you just want to push on the piston, be ready to catch it in case it falls down, because sometimes once they start going, they go down, they start falling pretty quick. And the last thing you want is just for it to fall right on the concrete floor or something like that. But just take your time, slowly push piece by piece. I think the easiest way to get it going is actually you take the butt end of a hammer and hit on the edge of the piston, as long as it's rubber or maybe wood, something softer, and just push on it a little bit and give it like a small kind of jab to where it starts to break free. And then it's just a matter of what you still have leverage on. I found it easiest then to actually take the other part of the connecting rod and push on it with my fingers to get the next part. And then to get that last kind of push out, I took a small end of a crescent wrench, a rubber crescent wrench handle, and pushed. That was small enough where I could just kind of push inside the piston and just push it all the way out. But yeah, it's just a matter of what you can kind of get leverage on, and just take your time and get these pistons out. I also wanted to make sure to not let them get like rubbed up against any oil or something like that, or any kind of fluid, for fear that it would rub away the markers. But that's another reason why we have multiple redundancies, where we wrote things down differently or multiple times. And as you'll even notice, the appearance of the top of the cylinders will match up, so that you can actually figure out orientation that way. And that's also why we made sure to reassemble everything immediately after taking the piston and making sure that the arrows lined up. Make sure to set aside an area here to reassemble the piston back the exact same way it came apart. You want to take a second to verify that the arrows and numbers line back up. And then we can put it back in our little organization box that we made here. And again, the multiple redundancies, make sure that we only have to do this once, and that everything comes together just fine when we reassemble the engine. So removing the main bearing caps is a little bit more of a process than you might imagine. You can start by just taking your breaker bar and breaking all of the bolts. With all of the bolts removed, we want to take two of them and use them for a trick that we're going to have for removing most of the main bearing caps. This only applies to every main bearing cap except for the center cap and the rearmost cap. For those, we're going to have to do something a little bit different. But for everything else, you want to put these bolts back into where they're just touching the main bearing caps themselves, push them together pretty hard, and kind of wiggle back and forth like you can see me doing here, all while also pulling up. And it takes a little bit of time, but eventually they just come right out. And this is the best method I've seen for removing these. So next you want to go back to your pile of parts that you removed and grab the front cover bolts. And we want to grab one of the long ones. And this is going to be useful because we're going to be threading this back into those two trickier main bearing caps, the center one and the rear one, and use some 2x4s to lever against it and pull it up on this bolt. So I just picked this one longer bolt here. So we're going to start with the center main bearing cap. Take a smaller 2x4 here to the point where you can put it up in this area kind of on the edge and push the crankshaft up to where it kind of wedges it in there and it doesn't move a whole lot. And then you can just take something kind of a crowbar or this end of a hammer and just pull it up. And that leverage really helps in pulling this one out. And the other one is a little bit different. You want to take a longer 2x4 to where it can go across the crankshaft. And and then just pull directly up. I found the rearmost one a little bit more difficult, but eventually it just came up, and then you can pull it right out. After that, you just want to spin out the crank pulley bolt that we inserted for ease of rotating the crankshaft. And that's really all that's left that you need to remove before you can just lift the crankshaft directly out of the engine. Of course, make sure you have a soft spot. Maybe put some paper down in a box or something to lay the crankshaft. It is kind of heavy, but it comes out pretty easy. And then you can just, I guess, admire your work here. So now you can remove the oil breather baffle and screen, which is just a Phillips head screw, 2 Phillips head screws. I tried to do this by hand, but I do not have an impact driver right now that I can hammer it down, and I was very worried that I would strip these screws. So I decided that rather than wrestle with that, I would leave that for another day when I actually have that with me. So you're going to want to remove most of the main bearings, except for the center and the frontmost one, by just kind of rotating them out of their spot, and then you can pull them directly out. You can see that the other ones are slightly larger, and for those, the best method is to just take a flathead screwdriver, hammer down on it very lightly, making sure you're only touching the actual bearing that you're removing itself, until one side rotates up, and then you can just grab that one side and pull it up until the whole thing comes out. That's going to be the end of this video. I still have a couple things that need to be removed from the block here. I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to remove the oil gallery plugs, because that is kind of a process and it may not be necessary. So I'm going to consult with my engine, the machine shop with that. Similarly, I have not removed some of those freeze plugs that I had issues with, but I will do that as part of a preparing for the machine shop kind of video. But again, this is kind of the end of this video. I appreciate everyone who has watched so far, and I hope to see you in the next one.